I never thought my life would shatter on a Tuesday afternoon while buying groceries. There I was, reaching for organic tomatoes when I saw them through the supermarket window. My husband Mark, walking hand in hand with my sister Sarah toward the Sunset Motel across the street. My heart stopped. 23 years of marriage, and this is how I discover his betrayal? With my own sister? The shopping cart slipped from my trembling hands, canned goods scattering across the linoleum floor. Other shoppers stared, but I couldn't move. I watched as Mark opened the motel room door, letting Sarah enter first like a gentleman. The same courtesy he'd shown me on our first date. The irony burned like acid in my throat. I stumbled to my car, my mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? The family dinners where they barely looked at each other. Was that an act? The way Sarah always asked about Mark's work schedule, claiming she worried about his stress levels. God, I was such a fool. Driving home felt surreal. Every red light gave me time to replay moments I'd missed. Sarah's sudden interest in fitness when Mark started his gym routine. Her new perfume that Mark complimented at Thanksgiving. The way she touched his arm when telling jokes, lingering just a second too long. The signs were everywhere and I'd been blind to them all. I sat in my driveway for an hour, staring at our house. The house Mark and I had painted together, where we'd raised our children, where we'd planned to grow old. The white picket fence we'd installed last spring suddenly looked like prison bars. How do you confront a betrayal this deep? How do you face your husband and sister knowing they've been living a lie? But I had to know the truth. I had to understand how my world had crumbled without me even noticing. Tomorrow I would follow them again. I would gather evidence, and then I would decide what to do with the pieces of my broken life. Little did I know the truth would be far more complex than a simple affair. The next morning I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. Mark kissed my forehead before leaving, asking if I needed anything from the pharmacy. His concern felt like mockery now. I waited 30 minutes, then drove to Sarah's apartment complex, parking where I could see her building's exit. At 2 p.m. she emerged wearing a sundress I'd never seen before, yellow with tiny flowers, the kind of dress you wear for someone special. My stomach churned as she drove toward downtown. I followed at a distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. She parked at the same motel. Room 237. I memorized the number, watching as she knocked in a specific pattern. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 more. Someone had taught her that signal. The door opened and Mark appeared, pulling her inside quickly. They were practiced at this deception. I sat in my car for 3 hours taking photos with my phone, documenting their betrayal. Other guests came and went. Traveling salesmen, tired truckers, young couples stealing afternoon moments. Normal people living normal lives while mine imploded behind a cheap motel door. When they finally emerged, Sarah looked different. Not guilty or satisfied like I'd expected, but relieved? Almost peaceful. Mark appeared exhausted, running his hands through his hair the way he did when solving complex problems at work. They didn't kiss goodbye. Instead, Mark handed her an envelope and Sarah squeezed his shoulder like you'd comfort a friend. That evening, Mark seemed distracted during dinner. He kept checking his phone, apologizing each time. Work crisis, he explained, but I knew better. I watched him push food around his plate, his mind clearly elsewhere. When he excused himself to take a call, I heard him whisper, "How did it go today? Are you feeling better?" I couldn't sleep that night, lying beside the man I'd trusted completely, wondering who he really was. The Mark I married was honest, faithful, devoted to family. This stranger sharing my bed was capable of elaborate deceptions. But something nagged at me about what I'd witnessed. Their interaction seemed wrong for lovers, too formal, too careful. What exactly was happening in that motel room? If you enjoyed the story, leave your comment, give it a like and subscribe. Thank you very much. I decided to confront Sarah first. She'd always been the weaker one, more likely to crack under pressure. I showed up at her apartment unannounced, my heart pounding as she opened the door. Her face went pale when she saw me, confirming my worst fears. "We need to talk," I said, pushing past her into the living room I'd helped her decorate last Christmas. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been supporting the woman who was destroying my marriage. "About what?" she stammered, but her eyes betrayed her guilt. "About you and Mark. About the motel. About how long you've been lying to me." My voice was steadier than I felt inside. Sarah collapsed onto her couch, burying her face in her hands. "You don't understand," she whispered. It's not what you think. Then explain it to me. I shouted, months of suppressed frustration exploding. Explain how my husband and my sister have been sneaking around behind my back. Explain those envelopes he gives you. Explain why you're destroying our family. She looked up with tears streaming down her face. I can't tell you. I promised Mark I wouldn't tell anyone. But it's not an affair, I swear on Mom's grave it's not an affair. Her words stopped me cold. Sarah never invoked our mother's memory lightly. But if it wasn't an affair, what could be so secretive that they'd risk everything to hide it? What required clandestine motel meetings and mysterious envelopes? Then what is it? I demanded. What's worth lying to me for months? Sarah stood up, pacing to the window. I'm sick, she said quietly. Really sick. Mark is the only one helping me through it. The words hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean sick? I can't tell you everything. But Mark found out by accident and he's been taking care of things. The motel meetings, they're not romantic. They're medical. Medical? My mind raced through possibilities, each more frightening than the last. But why the secrecy? Why couldn't she tell me, her own sister? What kind of illness required such elaborate deception? And why was my husband involved when I, her closest family member, was kept in the dark? Something still didn't add up. But Sarah's tears seemed genuine, and her explanation, while incomplete, felt more truthful than anything I'd imagined. Still, I needed to hear it from Mark himself. That night, I waited until Mark finished his shower before cornering him in our bedroom. He emerged wearing the blue pajamas I'd bought him for his birthday, looking so normal, so familiar that I almost lost my nerve. I know about Sarah, I said simply. Mark froze, his face cycling through surprise, fear, and resignation. He sat heavily on our bed, suddenly looking older than his 52 years. How long have you known? He asked quietly. I saw you at the motel. I followed Sarah today. She told me she's sick, but she wouldn't explain everything. So you're going to tell me the truth, Mark? All of it. Right now. Mark was silent for so long I thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah has been struggling with severe depression and anxiety. But it's more complicated than that. She's been having thoughts of hurting herself. The motel meetings aren't romantic. I've been taking her to see a therapist who operates out of that room. Dr. Martinez. He specializes in crisis intervention. My world tilted again. Why the secrecy? Why couldn't she tell me? Because she was ashamed. Because she didn't want you to worry. Because she was afraid you'd try to have her committed. Mark's eyes filled with tears. She made me promise not to tell you. She said if you knew how bad it was, you'd never let her out of your sight. The envelopes? Money for the sessions. Sarah lost her insurance when she quit her job. I've been paying for her treatment. I sank into our reading chair, overwhelmed. My sister was suicidal, and my husband had been secretly saving her life. All those months I'd spent feeling neglected, Mark had been carrying this enormous burden alone. Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me? I whispered. Because I was honoring Sarah's wishes. Because I didn't want to break her trust when she was so fragile. Because I thought I could handle it alone. Mark moved to kneel beside my chair. I'm sorry. I should have found a way to tell you. But even as relief flooded through me, questions remained. Something about this explanation still felt incomplete, like pieces of a puzzle that almost fit but not quite. The next day I insisted on going with Mark to meet Sarah. If my sister was in crisis, I wanted to help, secrets be damned. We drove to the motel in tense silence, Mark clearly uncomfortable with breaking Sarah's confidence. Room 237 looked different in daylight, seedier, more desperate. Mark knocked in that familiar pattern and Sarah opened the door, her face showing shock when she saw me. I told her, Mark said simply. She has a right to know. But as we entered the room I realized something was very wrong. There was no therapist. Instead, the room was set up like a makeshift medical facility. 4 bags, monitors, a hospital bed. And lying in that bed was a man I'd never seen before, pale and obviously very ill. Sarah, I whispered, what is this really about? My sister broke down completely. This is David, she sobbed. My son. The world stopped. You're what? I had a baby when I was 16. Remember when I went to stay with Aunt Helen for that summer? I was pregnant. I gave him up for adoption, but I never stopped looking for him. Sarah's words tumbled out between sobs. I found him 6 months ago. He's dying of kidney failure and he needs a transplant. Mark stepped forward. Sarah's a match, but the surgery is expensive and David's adoptive parents can't afford it. We've been meeting here because David is too sick to travel, and this was the only place we could set up the dialysis equipment privately. I stared at the young man in the bed, maybe 25, with Sarah's eyes and chin. My nephew. A nephew I never knew existed. The money? I asked weakly. For his medical care. For the equipment rental. For the surgery we're hoping to arrange. Mark's voice was gentle. Sarah didn't want to tell you because she was afraid you'd judge her for the teenage pregnancy, and she didn't want to burden you with another family crisis. David opened his eyes then, looking at me with curiosity. Are you Sarah's sister? She talks about you all the time. I moved to his bedside, taking his thin hand in mine. I'm your aunt, I said, the words feeling strange but right. And we're going to get you the help you need. As I looked around the room, at Sarah's tear-stained face, at Mark's exhausted but relieved expression, at this nephew I'd just discovered, I realized that sometimes the most shocking truth isn't betrayal but love. Love so deep and complicated that it requires secrets, sacrifices, and the kind of courage I'd never imagined my family possessed. The motel revelation wasn't about adultery. It was about a mother's love, a husband's loyalty, and a family's capacity to grow in the most unexpected ways.